morning, Jamal.
How you doing this morning?
Good.
You doing all right this morning? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh,
I can
okay.
hear you. Can you hear me?
Good, good. Yeah, no issues. All right, so three clips. So there's one with Peter Oliver. That one is going to be on Nord Stream 2. There's another one with Cuomo, but that's not Andrew Cuomo. That's newsman Cuomo. I forget his first name. That one is in the monologue, and that's going to be the first one in the monologue. And then Jen Psaki, um, on the Biden administration's immigration policy. Basically, Biden telling people to stay away.
That's gonna repeat twice, right?
Yeah, that one is going to be
Monologue
twice. That one is going to be
and
once in
then
the
right
monologue.
before.
Right. Yeah. 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 Perfect. It's the saddest thing ever, right? She's telling people like, "Well, we're on Univision telling people to stay away and don't come to the states." It's like, what? What? That's not gonna work, dog. All right, let me make sure this is set up.
1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition and another week of the most disruptive show covering news, events, and politics across our country and across our divided globe. In the Independent Corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, I hope everybody is having a good morning, and I hope you had a good weekend. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 572 new coronavirus deaths and 38,034 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Look at that lowish number, relatively low number, 38,000 new cases. We were seeing, 50, 60,000, 70,000, something like that on average for the last week, 2 weeks ish. 38,000 is a pretty low number. Just pointing that out, relative to the others. That leaves us with an average over the last 2 weeks of 54,832 cases per day. That's a decrease of 19% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 29,461,600 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 534,000 have died from it. Normally, 572 deaths on a single day from a single cause, that's not like sky high, but that's still decently high. normally that wouldn't be that much cause to celebrate, but compared to 5,000 deaths a day, 3,000 deaths a day, et cetera, and 120,000 or whatever new cases, we're doing a little bit better, whether that's the lockdowns or just winter ending. Anyway, more headlines here. Parents of school children protested in several cities around the United States over the weekend. They're frustrated by the off-again, on-again reopening policies in some school districts. Several hundred people rallied in downtown Naperville, Illinois on Sunday. In San Francisco and Pan Pacific Park in Los Angeles, hundreds of parents and children marched on Saturday, all in support of a 5-day in-person schedule. Teachers' unions have largely continued advocating slower reopenings to keep educators safe, with some unions saying access to vaccinations was a requirement before returning to school. Teachers are now eligible for vaccinations in all states. In national political news, Los Angeles, Seattle, and Portland all saw clashes between crowds and police on Saturday night as demonstrators marked the 1-year anniversary of Breonna Taylor's death in a police raid in Louisville, Kentucky. At least one officer was injured in the clashes. It was unclear if any protesters were injured. Taylor's family and their supporters have been seeking the prosecution of city police officers who participated in the raid that led to Taylor's death. 3 police officers have been fired, and 1 detective was charged for allegedly shooting into adjacent apartments during the raid, but none has been charged in connection with Taylor's death. Authorities in Kentucky stress that their investigation is continuing. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas announced he has ordered FEMA to help U.S. immigration officials receive and shelter migrant minors crossing the southern border without parents or legal guardians for the next 90 days. Children detained at a Customs and Border Protection holding facility in South Texas told lawyers they were being held in overcrowded conditions. Children also reported having to sleep on the floor, not being able to call family members, having limited access to showers, and not seeing sunlight in nearly a week. In addition to the FEMA deployment, Mayorkas said officials from other Department of Homeland Security agencies, including the Federal Protective Service and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, were also providing assistance with shelter operations and security. DHS said the marked rise in border crossings could be attributed to poverty, violence, and food insecurity in Central America. 11 or U.S. sanctions or U.S. coups, or some things the U.S. has done, but yeah, we leave that out, I guess. Anyway, 11 U.S. states have joined forces in an attempt to intervene in a lawsuit to challenge a decision by the administration of President Joe Biden to overturn an immigration policy set in place by his predecessor, Donald Trump. The suit has been filed by Arizona, Alabama, Arkansas, Indiana, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, Oklahoma, Texas, and West Virginia. I'm not going to go through all 50 states, don't worry. Those are just the ones who have joined this suit. Issued in 2019 and in effect in most states nationwide, Trump's policy had radically expanded the list of programs to consider when determining if a person is likely to become a public charge, which restricted immigrants perceived as reliant on welfare from receiving green cards. The Biden administration announced recently it would stop defending the rule, stating it was, quote, neither in the public interest nor an efficient use of limited government resources, end quote. Arizona Attorney Mark General Brnovich said in a statement that, quote, it is unconscionable to overwhelm our infrastructure and immigration personnel when we are dealing with the health and economic devastation of the pandemic. While regardless of one's position on immigration reform, this reckless violation of federal law is only creating another national crisis and putting additional strains on our state and hardworking Arizona taxpayers, end quote. The Alabama Republican Party will honor former President Trump for being, quote, one of the greatest and most effective presidents in the 245-year history of this republic, end quote. At a Saturday evening reception held at Mar-a-Lago, the party will present Trump with a framed resolution that grants him the honor. Members of the state's GOP unanimously voted on the resolution, which claims that President Trump put the American people and the American worker first in all of his decisions, quote unquote. Among Trump's accomplishments cited in the document are his success with Operation Warp Speed, his withdrawal from the, quote, job-killing Paris Climate Agreement, end quote, and his appointment of, quote, 3 constitutionally conservative judges, end quote. The resolution also bashes President Biden, stating that President Trump accomplished, I'm quoting here, accomplished more in 48 days than Joe Biden did in 48 years as a senator and vice president, end quote. Minneapolis City Council has approved a $27 million settlement with the family of George Floyd. From the settlement, $500,000 will go to funding community programs near the intersection where he died. The family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city in July, accusing officers of unjustified, I'm quoting here, unjustified, excessive, and illegal and deadly use of force, end quote. The suit sought to make it financially prohibitive for officers to kill marginalized people and black people in the future in America. That's another quote from the suit. Family also called on Minneapolis police to reform and break the python grip of the force's union contract, and for Congress to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, a bill that would ban chokeholds and reform qualified immunity from officers, making it easier to bring misconduct cases against the police. Settlement will not affect the ongoing criminal case against Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer charged with murdering Floyd. A county court began seating jurors earlier this week in the trial of Chauvin, who faces second-degree murder and manslaughter charges, as well as a recently re-added third-degree murder charge. 6 of 14 jurors have been seated. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat of California, repeatedly reaffirmed Sunday that she has zero tolerance for sexual harassment, but did not call on New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to resign. Nearly 90% of New York's congressional delegation has called for the governor's resignation or impeachment, as have more than 80% of state senators. Look at those numbers. Jamarl, 90% of New York's congressional delegation, more than 80% of state senators. That's a clear, that's like a majority with a mandate there, basically. And yet Cuomo still saying he doesn't plan to resign, still saying he wants the investigations to go through. What do you think, Nan?
I think this is a different media space. And I think Cuomo has been able to wedge himself in there and deal with all sorts of crises. I think this is different. I get the feeling that the way people are talking about it, the way the media is covering it, is different. And I think part of it is, look, you end up in a situation where, let's say Donald Trump leaves. Donald Trump is out. And where's the media focusing on at this point? From the standpoint of the Me Too Democrats that are in office, well, they're looking at Cuomo. How do you justify going after Donald Trump for the Me Too stuff, but not going after Cuomo? Especially with all of the litany of women at this point that have come forward saying, and honestly, the stories sound basically the same, which makes it even worse. It's not like, we jumped out of an airplane and he touched me while we were flying down with a, parachute. All of the women basically had this similar or same story, with one being a little bit more vulgar than the other. Also, the killing or the decisions that got all of these people killed and then trying to hide the bodies, that looks grotesque. And the wild part about it is, if Cuomo never did that, let's say he let the bodies be as what they were, this wouldn't be an issue. And I would even argue that I don't even think the women would be an issue. You disagree with me on that?
But no. That's where my mind was going, and that's what I was going to bring up too. I was going to pose the question to you: if he didn't have his name tagged to the death of thousands of grandmothers, to thousands of elderly folks who died based on his administration's decision to send people in nursing homes to hospitals and then send them right back to the nursing homes, before they were fully known to be fully clear of the virus, and how many more people those policies killed. I was going to ask, if that hadn't happened, how do you think this Me Too stuff, how do you think these, growing, like 7 by my last count,
wouldn't be an issue. Not the first women. First one would have never came forward.
That's the thing. I don't know that they would have come out, because I think people saw Cuomo coming under scrutiny and have progressively decided to tell their stories. That's probably what happened. And right now you've got 3, in sort of, I would argue, descending levels of deeper significance. You have 1, the thousands of deaths on his hands; 2, the sexual allegations, and then intertwined with and supporting the other 2, 3, serious allegations of like brute force politics inside his office and dealing with other politicians were very forceful, heavy-handed, and those are sort of unintentional puns with the sexual groping allegations, but very overbearing treatment with employees and staff, as well as other politicians, junior to him in the political hierarchy. And you can imagine, whether it's the sexual harassment or whether it's his administration's forceful misfires on the nursing home policy, trying to avoid scrutiny, and what you would have to do in order to successfully avoid scrutiny, with some sort of regimented policy from the top down in order to get out of that. they kind of support each other. The third one supports the first, and the third one supports the second in terms of the heavy-handed treatment. Anyway, this comes as last week, the state assembly initiated what could be the first step toward impeachment by opening an investigation with full subpoena power into sexual misconduct allegations against the governor and his handling of COVID-19 at nursing homes. When Biden was asked whether he agreed with other Democrats calling for Cuomo's immediate resignation, he said, quote, "I think the investigation is underway and we should see what it brings us," end quote. So he's falling on Cuomo's side of the line there. Now, technically, I mean, here's the thing. At the same time as I don't like any of the stuff we're accusing the governor of, or any of the stuff that he very clearly seems to have been doing, there is an argument, I guess, you could make for letting the law work its way through and letting the courts, with hopeful objectivity, work some of this stuff out. But at the same time, there's just a lot of stuff that has come out, and it seems pretty credible. From the leak that his aide told Democratic lawmakers privately that they were trying to evade Department of Justice scrutiny under Trump's administration over the killing of thousands of people, his administration's negligence and horrible decision to send people straight back to nursing homes from hospitals. There seems to be enough there that, like, the court of public opinion, beyond a reasonable doubt, can rule on this. On the other hand, I guess that, there is a legal system for a reason. But yeah, some more headlines. I'm going to get to them. Internationally, a Biden administration official who spoke on condition of anonymity said the White House reached out to Kim, quote, through several channels starting in mid-February, including in New York. They're talking about Kim Jong-un, and that, quote, "to date, we have not received any response from Pyongyang," end quote. Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State Antony Blinken are expected to meet with officials in Japan and South Korea next week. Those meetings will most likely highlight concerns about North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Former Bolivian interim president Janine Áñez was arrested on Saturday after the country's Attorney General's office issued arrest warrants the previous day.
Yes.
And 5 ministers from her former cabinet. Jamarl, you've been pushing for this one for a while.
Yeah, I'm excited about this one. I followed the story. Look, man, I am not a fan of coup government taking place, especially in a situation where that guy was a success. Meaning, by all of our metrics, he was a success. I'm talking about Evo Morales. He did what we wanted him to do from the standpoint of a leader. Healthcare for everybody. He brings the indigenous community more in line in regards to the politics of it. I think 70% of the community is indigenous. I could be wrong on the numbers, but it's a massive number of people that are indigenous. They've never had power. Never had power. He brings them to the government. And each step that he brings, the fascists in that country hate it. And the first opportunity they get to get rid of him, he won that election by 10 points. Put that in perspective. 10 points. And that's what happens. So yeah, I am all on board for this. This is a great day.
I hear you. I want to get to a couple more headlines before we're completely out of time. First of all, in Saudi Arabia, let's start with Myanmar. Activists are reporting that at least 50 protesters were killed yesterday in the bloodiest day yet in the country of Myanmar. We have a conversation. This is a pre-recorded segment we're going to be going to at 8:45 this morning, again with KJ No talking about the situation in Myanmar, going to the latest updates. Another highlight here, another fact to know, is that a number of Chinese factories have been burned. In terms of, we'll get to this later on with KJ, but in terms of the question of if China decides to get involved, I would argue that, could potentially contribute to a decision. Also of note, foreign laborers in Saudi Arabia are now able to switch jobs without receiving their employer's permission in a long-demanded change to the country's labor laws, specifically to the kafala system, which is used by the Arab states in the Persian Gulf, as well as several other countries in the region to procure employees for construction and general labor, but is often used by employers to abuse and exploit workers, extending their hours, denying their wages, and their right to leave. Critics have said the new law doesn't effectively revoke the kafala system, excluding millions of workers on short-term visas from these rule changes and leaving workers vulnerable to false charges brought by employers. With that, though, we've got to close. Those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're going into a break. We'll be back in a minute with our soapbox segment, Jamarl's monologue, and a short conversation on the topic he chose. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I've developed a fondness for watching administrative briefings. Now, I used to do this with PMQs in Britain. I used to get a kick out of it. The guys going after each other. I'm not going to take a lesson from you on et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I've watched our own briefings this time. I have never done this with any other president, but Jen Psaki, Ned Price, love them. I sit there and watch it. It's phenomenal. It's like our own little ministry of truth. Ned Price goes for 1 hour, almost as if he wakes up that morning. How do I tell people that there is no spoon in 60 minutes? Entirely different ways, but 60 minutes. And his goal is, how do I say nothing for all of that time while having my mouth moving and using a lot of words? It is the weirdest thing ever. How do you not give a straight answer? That's basically what this seems to be. And listen, I realized as I watched this, and even for the most part, as I watched mainstream news over the weekend, as they talked about immigration, and oh my God, the kids, the unaccompanied minors, they're flooding the United States. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I noticed in all of these conversations, whether it was taking place all day on CNN or somewhere else, it was always limited to what is Biden going to do, and not why are they here? How did they get here? Why are they leaving their country? Is there anything potentially that we're doing to get these kids in a situation where their country is on fire, where they would come here? The conversation never went there. Meaning you could never really analyze why those kids have ended up in such a precarious situation there at the border, and the contradictions that are associated with U.S. policy versus the blowback from that U.S. policy. You can never take the extra step. And because you can never take the extra step, you basically always have a perpetuating situation where people keep showing up at our border because those countries continue to be on fire. For example, you can never even criticize a policy because you can never really state the policy. Under U.S. policy, we don't believe in coups, despite the fact that Ned Price will answer a question on Venezuela and say a man that hasn't won a pie shop is president of that country. It's astonishing to hear him say, and the media just kind of accepts this as okay. It's their bias. It's an astonishing thing. I realized as I watched all of this that regardless of how much we are despised, we are needed. We are necessary. And not just necessary from a standpoint of giving a point of view, we're necessary because our point of view tries to give context to a point of view that doesn't seem to have any even built into it. Meaning it doesn't seem to have the capacity to even ask the questions that are necessary to give the American public a contextual point of view of their world. It's utterly astonishing to watch. For example, the quote that, God, I love this video. Andrew Cuomo talking to Jill Stein about the presidential elections. Well, they're attacking Jill Stein, calling her an asset or whatnot, and Jill Stein defending herself. And Jill Stein says the most truest thing in the world. She gives him context. And listen to what he says, to what she says. It is perfectly true, perfectly honest, perfectly right. If you're sitting on the moon looking at events and you're looking for an objective point of view, what she told him was perfectly right. Listen to his answer. Please, play the clip.
Position right now and not go at it with bombs and missiles and threats, but with international dialogue, and we need a treaty for international non-interference in elections.
You know, that would really be the case for Russia to make, not from the American perspective. Of course, there's hypocrisy involved. Lots of different big state actors do lots of things that they may not want people to know about. But let Russia say that the United States did this to us, and here's how they did it, so this is fair play. From the American perspective, and you running for president more than once of this country, shouldn't your position have been, this was bad what they did, they're trying to do it right now, and we have to stop it?
I love that question, because he accepts that what she said was right. But he says, look, shouldn't that be for the Russians to say? Shouldn't you take an American perspective? Oh, I love that. That's saying the quiet part out loud. And that's just it, Cuomo, whether you realize it or not. That contextual understanding of the world is not for the Russians to impart. That's for us to impart. In fact, people thought that's what you were doing. They didn't realize you were just giving them the state propaganda that they were getting from the Ministry of Truth. Nobody realized that. They thought they were getting that contextual understanding of the world from you. And therein lies the problem. If they are not getting that contextual understanding of the world from you, and they're getting a perspective that basically puts them at odds, when context gives them a little bit more bandwidth, a little bit more understanding, a little bit more clarity, it may not fit within the context of, let's go bomb that person, the moment that the American gets the fuller perspective of it. But it is the more honest point of view. And that honest point of view, you basically slam down and say, that is not what you should be doing. You should be given propaganda. I'm sorry. The American point of view. I love that clip. That clip is awesome. Look, I'm making the point that when I watched these videos over the weekend and when I watched the stuff taking place about the immigration, why it was happening, the argument was so truncated. What is Joe Biden going to do? And that seems to be where it stops. Why are they coming to the border? Does our policy have anything to do with that? And the reason why that's important is because if you acknowledge that, hey, when Hillary Clinton was involved in getting rid of Zelaya in Honduras, and the guy who comes in is basically trying to put coke into the nose of every American, maybe that guy's not a partner. And maybe the lefty that you didn't particularly like, maybe that guy was the best guy for that particular nation. And if you can't acknowledge that blowback came as a result of us taking a particular action, or at the very least backing up something that we should not have been backing up, meaning the coup government, and allowing that coup government to stay in, I am making the point that if you can't acknowledge that, then you can't see the mistakes later. Maybe you shouldn't be trying to get rid of Maduro if you don't like the fact that all of those Hondurans are at your border. Leave their country alone. Maybe they will stay in their countries. And by the way, this goes into even the conversation that Jen Psaki is having. Listen to what Jen Psaki says here. This is the weirdest and funniest conversation ever. And yet, again, it does not go beyond the level of, oh my God, look at all of these kids at our border. Let's play the clip of Jen.
We just heard from Jake Sullivan talking about on immigration, the need to have a consistent and continued message to communicate to migrants that the border is closed right now. We saw Ambassador Jacobson. He says there has to be a message on the airwaves and in that region as well. If you want to send the message to migrants that the border is closed, shouldn't President Biden be the one who is clearly delivering that message?
Well, he did do an interview with Univision about 2 weeks ago and made that absolutely clear. And I certainly expect he will look for the opportunity to do exactly that. I will note, however, that he is one of the voices. Ambassador Jacobson is one of the voices. There are a number of effective voices in the region, including leaders in the region, including partners we need to have in the region, NGOs and others, to deliver the same message that now is not the time to come, that the majority of people are turned away at the border, which is backed up by factual data, that adults, families will be turned away at the border in almost every scenario. And so that is part of the data and part of the information that we're looking for partnership to deliver in the region.
Is it working?
Well, again, Peter, I think we know, we've seen the numbers that CBP puts out on a regular basis. We know there are more children under the age of 18 who are, of course, coming across the border. That is consistent with what our policy has been. But in terms of people who were turned away, who are coming to the border, who are turned away, I mean, those numbers, are people hearing that? Are they still making the journey? I don't have any further analysis of that. I know that what people are looking at is that there are more children who are coming across the border, and we've certainly...
Just so we're clear, let's stop it. Let's stop it. Let's stop it. Let's stop it. I'm gonna help her out. The answer is no, it's not working. Notice how many words she used. It's almost like they're filibustering in order to ensure that there's not enough time to ask follow-up questions in order to pierce the veil of the thing that they're saying. It's astonishing that she's using that many words to basically say, no, it's not working. I guess the point here is you can't analyze why it's happening. I mean, you can't bring up that, hey, maybe our policies have something to do with it. And then further on, you can't even have a really good conversation about the contradictions in Biden's policies. Biden has created such a strident opposition to Trump that regardless of what Joe Biden said when he came into office, it looked as if the border was open, especially considering the vaccinations. Meaning the moment that COVID is going down and the moment that somebody like Trump is out of office, you are opening the border, especially when Biden creates a policy for unaccompanied children. The Biden administration made the decision to stop expelling them, to allow them to come to the country when they come to the border, and once in the country to be able to come into what is known as a shelter system, a system where services are provided to them. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just making a point that the moment that you make that policy, people are going to come to the border. Also, you as president are never going to create a policy that makes things so harsh and so belligerent that are going to overwhelm and be worse than the hellholes that they're coming from, inspired by U.S. policy. You have a contradiction, Joe Biden. What are you going to do? It takes us to say that, and the other media networks in no way get into the details of it. What do you think, Shane? Are we the weight of what America feel in their gut that's missing in news that just is never said on mainstream media because they basically agree? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a comfort that comes from ignoring a weight. So yeah, I think we can serve that role. I mean, Ned Price, a quick comment on him. He's a longtime spook, just looking into him from 2006 to 2017. He was with the CIA, and then he conspicuously left the CIA in protest of Donald Trump. And now he's a State Department spokesperson. So that's not putting a cap on it, because of course we're going to be covering him, but to give a rough summary of where he's coming from and where that mindset comes from, he's a CIA dude. And on Jen Psaki's response there, I mean, you can hear beneath her words and her tone that she's anxious. I think this is simply about the issue that she's talking about. She's talking about immigration. That's one of Biden's major soft spots right now, and he is getting hit hard on it by Republicans and by some Democrats, but probably not enough. We'll be talking about this, by the way, in a bit more depth at 9:30 when we speak with Kim Iverson, 9:30 a.m. Eastern. We're going into Biden's policies on immigration, so stay tuned for that. And with that, we've got to go into a break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back on the other side of this short break with our next guest, Mark Frost, talking about wage stagnation. Be right back. No, Mark.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want? News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
No, Mark.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're in the process of bringing our guest Mark Frost on. I have him on the phone, but there's a little bit of a technical problem apparently with the audio. Anyway, we're going to be talking with him about wage stagnation. A quick and kind of boring phrase that basically represents decades at this point of stagnation and decay. And just the short story, I guess, means that single people can't support a family. A single income can't support a family. Most millennials, Gen Xers, Gen Zers, etc., face dim prospects of owning a home. Just sort of basic ways of improving your lot in life creating a stable future in the form of a family or even just an economic future, all those things are largely rosy memories reserved for history. And so we're going into what exactly caused that, what we could do to fix it, et cetera, when we bring Mark on. But I will admit the phrase wage stagnation, a little bit of a boring one, but there's a real deep reality there that we want to get into with our guest when we get him. We were also, last time we had Mark on, it was fun, man. Almost got into a fight. We're talking about minimum wage, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour on a federal level. Biden administration's promises and failure to deliver on that. But without further ado, we've got the man now. We are joined by Mark Frost. For those listening, Mark Frost is an entrepreneur, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout. He's a Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. And we will come back to exactly what being a Schumpeterian means and who Joseph Schumpeter was. But Mark, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing quite well. How about you?
Good. I think we're both better for having you. Thank you for being with us. Hope you had a good weekend, and let's get into the conversation. Wage stagnation. Like I was saying, this is, if you know what it is, it probably has more meaning than if you don't, by definition. But for those who aren't as familiar with it, it sounds a little bit boring, but I would argue it's like a deep, deep factor in the American psyche. The idea that at one point in not too recent, but not too distant history, a single person could support a family and save up enough money over some time to buy a house, potentially even outright without getting a mortgage and without having a ludicrously high-paying job. And that is now distant history. That is almost out of the living memory of most Americans. And we wanted to bring you on to talk about why you think that happened, what we can do to fix it, and how right I am. The idea here is if wages had kept going up at the rate they were, say, in the 50s, the 60s, and they had kept rising to this point at the present day, we would be seeing much higher income for laborers, for people who are doing pretty much any kind of work. But as it is, the skew seems to be the people who are fairly rich or who are working jobs that pay well, they make a ton of money, and the money they're making seems to be increasing. But for the vast bulk of Americans, there's long-run wage stagnation, where basically you can't purchase the same amount of some types of goods as you could back in the 50s, just based as a percentage of your wages. So some cost of some goods has increased, the cost of some goods has decreased, but ideally, in a highly advanced technological society, things would get cheaper and cheaper over time. People would have a better and better lot. We're not living in the days of Malthus anymore. Anyway, Mark, I wanted to turn to you. What are your thoughts on this?
It's a very complicated issue, and everybody's tempted to say, this is the cause of this phenomena, and there is no the cause. There's multiple forces at work that are causing this phenomena, but it is quite real. I remember just even as a kid, I have two older sisters, 10 and 12 years older. And I remember back in even the house growing up, when my mom died, I found the title to the house, 360 payments of $86 a month. She paid $86 and some change 360 times, and her house was paid off and that kind of stuff. And that house raised 3 kids. And she didn't work outside the home. And yet we had food, we had clothes, we had this and that. And so what you're talking about is this phenomenon where people wake up one day and they're like, okay, I'm making money, but I can't buy anything with it. It's not enough. Even though I'm getting paid, the inflationary pressures from what I'm used to have really damaged this. And there's lots of reasons that go into it. One of them is government policy. There's no getting around that. That's true. But you do have to understand that part of government, I think, is setting the rules of the game. If you let the market work on its own, it's going to commodify anything it can. If it can commodify yo-yos, it will. If it can commodify anything, it will. And if it can commodify people, it will do that, because that's what markets do. It's literally what they do. I also want to get back to one of my favorite soapboxes is the two Americas. I agreed with pretty much everything you said except your last thing when you're saying like the vast majority of people. I don't think that's true. I think there's really two Americas. I think there's people that are doing very, very well, and there's millions of them that are doing very well in the United States. The problem is there's also millions of people not doing very well. And that's the problem we have in this country. At some point, we have to wake up, grow up, and decide what kind of government that we want. Helping poor people via government is not socialism. It's redistributive capitalism. There's nothing wrong with a society getting together and saying, you know what? I don't like walking down the street and seeing all these homeless people, and I don't like the thought that we're commodifying people. So we're going to vote, and we want our taxes to increase, and we're going to, with those increased taxes, we're going to help folks. So my problem with the minimum wage is it's almost entirely ceremonial. The people that it would actually be effective with, and last time I explained there's two types of minimum wage legislation, ceremonial and one that actually has an impact. If the market wage is $20 an hour and the minimum wage is $100 an hour, that's going to be really impactful. So there'll be a large impact. That will be a strong, effective minimum wage. An ineffective minimum wage is ceremonial. The market wage is $10, and you say, okay, you must pay people at least $1. Well, everybody's already getting. There is no wage below $1. So that's sort of the economic dynamics at it right now. Because there's also,
but there are millions of people. There are millions of people who are making. There are millions of people who are making less than $15 an hour, and the last time I did the research, it was many millions. I was having a little
40
bit of a
million.
hard time finding
It's 40 million
under that cap. But yeah, Jamarl, exactly, tens of millions of people.
Oh, absolutely. But there's also tens of millions of people that are exceptionally happy with their career monetary growth.
I don't know if how many of the 40 million people, if you were to take a straw poll and ask them, are you exceptionally happy with your career prospects and growth? I think to a rounding error, the vast majority would say no.
And look,
give a flat no.
From Joe Biden,
monetary aspect.
Well, taking it from Joe Biden, it's a starvation wage, and our heroes shouldn't be on a starvation wage. I mean, they were our heroes. They were out there in the COVID thing when we needed food and whatnot. And Joe Biden, as president and as vice president, he said they can't. Our heroes can't go hungry. They can't live on the starvation wage, etc. Now it seems like we're abandoning our heroes. I mean, am I wrong? And like Shane said, it's like 40 million people that are benefited from this. Like, this is not trivial, if that makes sense. Like, it actually has impact. Look, if my mom was making $15 an hour when I was growing up, we would have had a substantially different life. I'm telling you, it matters. And I mean, what do you say, Mark? I don't want to. We're both of us are talking, so I want you to be able to respond.
Well, minimum wages. I've been pretty consistent on minimum wages. They help the people that already have jobs. They do nothing to the people that have severe structural employment problems within the labor market. If you go search the literature, there's a strong correlation between minimum wage legislation that's effective. Again, if it's ceremonial, it's just a joke. But if it's serious legislation, like when Indonesia tripled their minimum wage, minimum wages, like all price floors that are effective, will cause unemployment, because all unemployment is a surplus. It's a surplus in the labor market. That's what unemployment is. So
what if you? Okay, so what if you go? This is arguably.
I want society to target. I want society to target the people that need the help the most, and a minimum wage might help them, but there's also a cost. That's the problem that we have in policy. There is always consequences in terms of additional opportunity costs. Always. There's always going to be that. And what we don't want to do is to just continue this situation where we have this political economy where we let two Americas jump up. So we pass some laws, we help this union over here, we don't help these people over there. It would be so much smarter and I know I'm asking probably too much of our leaders, to get together and say, what type of welfare state do we want to have? And if you say we don't want a welfare state, I don't believe you, because almost everybody I talk to wants one. They just want one for a different reason. Wall Street wants one. Crackhead Bob wants one. Everybody wants one. They just want it their way. So minimum wage legislations, I think, are things that politicians talk about knowing that it's not that big of a deal.
Okay, well, let's think of this in a different way, Mark. How would you frame it? Because maybe we're putting them in constraints. It's like this question of, it's like either God doesn't care or God, and it's like, well, no, the problem is you're putting constraint on God and the way that you're answering it. Maybe the world is not set up in the way that you're framing it. It's that type of stuff. So maybe we're framing it wrong.
Ooh, I like that analogy. You gave me a religious analogy.
Well, I was trying to get across that sometimes the framing of it gets it, meaning you put so much information in the framing of it that the person doesn't have latitude in order to act. So it's like it forces an answer. I'm saying maybe we're answering or asking a question in that kind of context. How would you frame it? Because you're right. I mean, well, I don't think you're right in the sense that everybody wants a welfare state. I think Rand Paul would be perfectly okay. I don't know. Do you remember when they were asked, I believe it was Ron Paul, and they said, should you let him down the street? And people were like, let him die. They was like screaming on the stage and whatnot. It's like red meat for these guys. But I do think most people would. I don't think most people don't want people living on the street. I don't think most people want people in deprivation. And it would just be this question of where's the line and where's the welfare state? So how would you answer that? If the question is something that you need to frame and like, all right, you have X number of thousands of people or millions who would never be able to function, meaning they couldn't pass a military test, whatever that means. And on top of that, you have to deal with a certain number of people who may not want to be a software engineer. They may not want the technological job. Meaning, as your society changes, you have to continuously accommodate larger numbers of people in order to get those people either in the jobs or find ways for those people to support themselves. How would you do that? And how would you frame that in a way that doesn't include a minimum wage?
Well, I would not include a minimum wage. I like the idea of having a government program, just like they take money out of your check every week or every 2 weeks or every month. I would like to see a program by which if you lose your job, it's not you don't even have to lose your job. Something happens in your life and you're suffering. You lost your job, whatever the case might be, but you're monetarily suffering, and so let's just look at it as social insurance. The government will give you I want the government to provide basic safety nets, and I believe it can be paid for by consolidating all the inefficient programs out there that would be redundant. It's like Milton Friedman said, if you really want to help somebody, don't give them cookies, give them money, give them a check. If you really want to help Crackhead Bob, give him a check. Yeah, he's going to go spend some of it on drugs. But there's a reason Crackhead Bob does drugs, and almost always when I go find people that are squabbling in their marriage, or when they're unhappy with their family, or they're mad at their kids, 99 times out of 100, when I peel the onion back, there's a financial problem going on. And that's the problem that I think that we have in this country. We have that rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And in an agrarian society where everybody basically has to wake up in the morning and do the same thing, that's probably great. But the truth of the matter is, there are people in the country that are thousands of times more productive than the least productive people. I'm not even sure there's going to be enough work at the low end of the pay scale in the future to even justify a 5-day work week. I would seriously look into I bet people would like a 4-day work week. For the workaholics like me oh my God, that sounds like hell. You don't have to, but for regular normal folks, I'd like to see something like that happen. Sometimes we think in terms of dollars too much, when the real opportunity cost, since we're going to get religious a little bit here, the real opportunity cost of poverty isn't that the person is poor. It's that the person very often doesn't have the basic needs that are required to go compete in a increasingly competitive marketplace that wants to commodify everything.
Mark, you are a difficult person to
That's the purpose
interview.
of government, to stop the commodification.
I swear, you're a difficult person to interview. Because you have a tendency to be very sane, even in things that you start off saying it in a way where I disagree, but you end up in a way where I kind of do agree. At the very least, your acknowledgement of it. I agree with that analysis all the way through. I don't, let's go to the next one. I agree with that. I think that's absolutely right. This over emphasis on profit that blinds us to certain ideas that are coming forward. How do we grapple with this notion of, the rugged individualists when we're not really rugged individualists at all? If you look at how much Medicare pays and stuff like that for hospitalizations and whatnot. But yet we want to keep the idea. But the thing is that conception and that idea kind of creates difficulties when you get to a point where we don't need all of those people for work. And those people were, under normal circumstances, considered lazy bums, considered not worthy of, food or shelter because they're not necessarily working. And how does this society change from we have not enough work to we have too much work? And will the conception of it, how does that transition take place? And what does that transition look like? Oh, that just looks really dark. The voice that you guys were listening to is Mark Frost. He's an entrepreneur, economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian. We're going to be back with Mark Frost in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined by Mark Frost. He's an entrepreneur, an economist, a professor, a consultant, a dreamer, a drummer, I'm sure a dreamer too, an Eagle Scout, a Marine, a capitalist, a Schumpeterian, and a recovering libertarian. And normally he's on Twitter, but he's taking an extended break, and really, I can't blame him. Mark, thank you again for being with us. I want to transition slightly. We've been talking about the minimum wage for the last 7, 8, maybe even 10 minutes. What some of our other guests have brought up, and what some in the chat room have brought up, what we've talked about potentially, and I'm not sure how I feel about this, but I want to get your take, is instead of a minimum wage or in addition to a minimum wage, and this is one you would have heard before, the idea of full guaranteed employment, where people, largely I'm sure through government programs in the long run, are reemployed by the state to productive purposes to earn money. I'll just hand it over to you. What's your take on that?
I would need to see the details because the devil's always in the details, but just generically, I don't like the idea of that because what that does is it turns government into mommy and daddy. Government now controls your job. I don't mind government generically helping people out and sending a check but let people go figure that kind of stuff out for themselves. Because what will happen is the unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences here are that people without jobs are going to be patronized. They're going to be looked down on. They're going to be told they have to go do work they don't want to do. There's going to be cries, oh, they're not really suffering that hard. There's going to be the self-righteous out there that wants them working harder, blah, 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 blah. I just don't want to empower the federal government with that type of monopsonist market power. I don't like that idea. I love the idea of, as a society, we come together and we decide what kind of a country we want to have. Again, I would love to have another constitutional convention to go and debate certain things that are probably obsolete today, or better said, that were probably obsolete at the time the Constitution was written. Let's have a tangent real quick. Let's take the Second Amendment. Regardless of what you feel about it, there's a wealth of legislative history in that, which makes it pretty clear in the debate that the purpose of the Second Amendment was to keep the people having military parity with the federal government. Well, my God, we have tactical nukes now. Can I build a tactical nuke in my backyard? Is that the kind of society we want to live in? Because the anarcho-capitalist libertarians, that's what they want. They want a governmentless society. And I think that's just insane. The purpose of government is to provision justice. As Joseph Schumpeter said, the stock market is a poor substitute for the Holy Grail. Unless you're crazy, I doubt anybody's going to fall on a grenade to save the stock market, to keep the stock market high. I don't see a lot of people doing that. But people will fall on a grenade to save their buddy, their platoon, their way of life. And it's something we've lost in this country. I was offended that the market just blew up during this pandemic when the actual brunt of the pain of it was so disproportionately felt by the working class.
Well, people won't fall on the grenade, but they could be pushed onto it.
That's what I was thinking the same thing, Shane. I was like, they're going to be thrown on it. That's
happened a couple of times recently. I mean, here's another thing though, man. We're talking about a universal basic income or even a conditional basic income, where, like you were saying, if you go through serious economic grievance, the government starts to disperse you money to deal with that grievance. Or just if you look at an unconditional basic income, a universal one where everybody gets a certain flat amount of money on a monthly basis, ideally enough to give at least basic means of self-support and a bit of leisure time, and some abilities to engage in leisure activities, that kind of thing. Either way, whether it's that or a universal employment program, those are two different types of mommy, daddy states, whatever. Those are two types of paternalistic or maternalistic states, where on the one case, you're getting a free allowance, and on the other, you've got to work for it. I don't see how you get away from it. The moment that we get into these kinds of conversations, the moment that you grant that level of protection, whether for job or for income without a job, you're getting into the same kind of circumstance. What's your take on that, Mark? Is it just that you would prefer the one to the other?
I think you can. I mean, what is important to keep in mind, we're not going to get our own individual version of an ideal world. First of all, we're too diverse, and we would argue for days on what ideal even is. I think what we need to do is to grow up. There is, I mean, and I'm really serious. A part of this is just culture dies hard. And I think it's important to work hard. I think you should work hard toward the things that you value. I think that's part of virtue. That's a virtuous person to me. When I see someone that's lazy, I mean, they're literally lazy. They don't want to, it's not that they don't want to work. They don't want to do anything. They want to sit around and play games all day or something. But it's not my kind of person. I don't really hang out with those types of people. I like to hang out with people that are trying to do things, that are doing something kind of interesting, and it bleeds off into me. I learned that a long time ago. There's nothing wrong. Here's the big problem. There is an assumption that if you take any form of welfare, you're a bad person. And that's the cultural aspect that we have to get over, because I can prove to you with a computer using Monte Carlo types of analyses that in an economy of 300 million, you must, let's capitalize that word must, you must have X million people not doing very well. You're going to have about 1/10 X of the people that are just doing superbly. And then you're going to have a under the bell curve type folks, which in a healthy economy are the vast majority of people. Yeah, you have a poor person problem. You always will. As Jesus said, you're always going to have the poor. And I don't think you're going to get rid of poor by government process. I remember reading about the Great Society. Johnson just did some math. He goes, well, if we gave X, if we took the number of poor and divided that in to this, we could come up with the amount of money. We could just eliminate poverty overnight. Well, flash forward several decades, and we have more poor people than we ever had. This is what economists mean by unintended consequences. I'm sure they have existed, but I doubt there's been many politicians that wake up in the morning and they say to themselves, how can I harm the American people? I don't think politics works that way. I think things are done and people choose options, and a big, giant, complex game theoretic model comes out, and people sort of start making their choices based on their perceptions of what other people are doing. But from a welfare perspective, what we have to get over is this concept that the poor are poor only because they're immoral. And I find that indelible through the society. People don't have a lot of empathy for poor people, it seems like, but they have great praise for success. So let's look at my business. It's a payments company. So if you're a merchant and you want to take payments, credit cards, whatever, you need those payments facilitated and cleared with Visa, MasterCard network, you come to me. Well, we had a pandemic last year. What did everybody want? Contactless payments. Our profits increased tenfold. I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything brilliant. I didn't do anything fancy. I didn't do anything that you could point to and say, Mark Frost is so smart. He led this company and caused this amount of profit to come in. It's not true. It was pure 100% luck. I happened to have a payments company at just the time that there was problems coming up, and I happened to understand just the mechanics of all those devices. So now, did I do anything? How did I learn this stuff? Well, I put the effort in to learn it, but I didn't go out and entrepreneurially make this business successful. It was luck, just like a Monte Carlo study would predict there would be people like me. It can't predict which ones, but it can tell you this is the distribution that you're going to see. And so I think that's very, very important. And I think it's something we have to change as a society, where we just can't have empathy for someone. I see it all the time, especially in the South here. Highly judgmental. It's, well, that person shouldn't have this. It's their own fault. It's well, big deal. Maybe it is their own fault. I still don't want to see them living out in the street unless that's what they're wanting to do. I'd still like to do whatever I can within reason to try to help those people. As an economist, I don't believe in
interesting.
No child
We've got to
left
close
behind.
it. We've got to close the segment out. We're out of time. Thank you for joining us. For those listening, Mark Frost, entrepreneur, Schumpeterian, recovering libertarian. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours of this morning show.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe, welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In this corner, I am your ever-vigilant, indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I'm sorry, I'm laughing at Mark Frost. Mark Frost is a recovering libertarian. The libertarian thing always stands out at me because the earlier conversations him and I had, he sounded full on like a libertarian. He is talking about empathy here. That is not a word I typically hear come out of a libertarian mouth. He is going on a tangent on it. He could have sounded like any flaming lefty that you would hear. He could have sounded like me, for God's sake. So, if recovering is right, recovering libertarian is right. What do you say? Like somebody recovering from drugs. Just seeing the light.
That's how I put it, or ideology.
No, that's great. I always love Mark Frost when he comes on. That's what I mean. He's like, you never know what's going to come out of him when he talks about stuff like that. No, that's great. At least five. Let's get to the news. In the news, at least 572 new coronavirus deaths and 38,034 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 54,832 cases per day, a decrease of 19% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,461,600 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 534,000 have died. Parents of school children protested in several cities around the United States over the weekend, frustrated by the off-again, on-again reopening policies in some school districts. Several hundred people rallied in downtown Naperville, Illinois on Sunday. In San Francisco and Pan Pacific Park in Los Angeles, hundreds of parents and children marched on Saturday, all in support of a 5-day in-person schedule. Teacher unions have largely continued advocating slower reopenings to keep educators safe, with some unions saying access to vaccinations were a requirement before returning to schools. Teachers are now eligible for them in all states. I suppose that the vaccinations are going to take place relatively soon. I think Biden said May, having everybody be able to pretty much hang out together in July. More importantly, more interesting are the contradictions built into this. I would wager many of the parents that want to have their kids back to school, I would wager that there is something to do about those parents being back to work. Meaning, if nobody is watching my kid, who's going to watch my kid? And I can't stay at home to watch my kid, and I might not be able to afford daycare to watch my kid, meaning I need that kid back to school in order for me to go from point A to point B. It's very possible that some of the parents that are marching at those meetings have everything to do with their own personal need, not necessarily the concern of the teacher. They may end up getting ill from going back to school too soon. It's the difference between the needs of the parents versus the needs of the teachers. And in this case, of course, the needs of the teachers have everything to do with not dying of COVID. Just point out, it's interesting. Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland all saw clashes between crowds and police. Saturday night, as demonstrators marked the one-year anniversary of Breonna Taylor's death in a police raid in Louisville, Kentucky. At least one officer was injured in the clashes. It was unclear if any protesters were injured. Taylor's family and their supporters have been seeking prosecution of city officers who participated in the raid that led to Taylor's death. 3 police officers have been fired. One detective was charged for allegedly shooting into an adjacent apartment during the raid, but none have been charged in connection with Taylor's death. Authorities in Kentucky stress that the investigation is continuing. Is it now? The guy that was charged, just to go back a minute, cops break into a house. And as they break into the house, they're undergoing a no-knock warrant. Now, this is America. And we have basically as many guns as we have people in this country. And they are busting down a door without necessarily giving notice. Now, they say they gave notice. You have plenty of people who are there saying they heard nothing of the sort. And not to mention, the people are in bed. The cops break in. The person who's there, who's defending his girlfriend, fires a shot. The cops open fire. Now, who's wrong in this situation? The cops that just broke down the door without announcing who they were, or the person who was defending the territory? And what's wild about it is the person who gets charged is the person who misses. Put that in perspective. So the people who basically hit and killed somebody who was in their bed, black while sleeping, they walk. The person who misses gets charged. Yes, those people are very angry because basically you just had somebody who was murdered while they were sleeping, and it was a clean murder, as stated by the government anyway. Yeah, those people have a right to be upset. All of us have a right to be upset. That's basically an injustice. Imagine, you can't even be asleep in your own home, in your own bed. And we're talking about situations where cops shot through windows, all sorts of stuff. This is whatever provisions that they were putting in for the standpoint of the local laws and everything else, fair enough, but that should have been prosecuted. And the fact that that's not prosecuted gets across something fundamentally wrong with the laws in this country around this notion of policing. That's a travesty. Every day that goes forward with those people unprosecuted for killing that woman is a travesty of justice. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas announced that he ordered FEMA to help U.S. immigration officials receive and shelter migrant minors crossing the southern border without parents or legal guardians for the next 90 days. Children detained at Customs and Border Protection holding facility in South Texas told lawyers they were being held in overcrowded conditions. But children also reported having to sleep on the floor, not being able to call family members, having limited access to showers, not seeing sunlight in nearly a week. In addition to the theme of deployment, Mayorkas said officials from other departments of Homeland Security agencies, including the Federal Protective Services and U.S. Immigration and Customs ICE, were also providing assistance with shelters, operations, and security. DHS said the marked rise in border crossings can be attributed to poverty, violence, and food insecurity in Central America. You don't say! You don't say! You don't say! I'm glad you could bring that up. Let's dig deeper, though. Is it possible that it has something to do with us knocking over governments, putting in strongmen in those various countries? Does that have anything to do with it at all? And the wild part about this is we're still trying to do this to Venezuela, despite the fact that we're complaining about the number of people who are showing up at our borders. And I keep pointing out the Honduras one because that one is the most egregious to me. The guy's talking about putting cocaine in the nose of every gringo. Us. He's talking about us. He's putting cocaine in all of our nose. 300 to a million people. That's our partner. And we didn't like the last guy that was there. And so Clinton was perfectly okay with working with the coup government to keep that guy from coming back to power. But this guy is our partner. It's astonishing. And for you to be able to say that, it says the border crossings can be attributed to poverty, violence, and food insecurity. Yes! And you can never create a border situation or create a situation that you're incoming that's going to be as bad as conditions to which they found themselves in their countries. Also, with COVID going down, also with Donald Trump leaving, also with you saying you're going to keep the kids, yes, all of that stuff has a direct result in the number of kids who are coming to the borders. Also, the locations, meaning because of COVID, the space has gone down. So because you need more space in regards to where the kids are going to be, well, they don't necessarily have all of the space that they would have had under normal circumstances, let's say without COVID. So yeah, it's a perfect storm for one Joe Biden. And a lot of it has to do with a combination of the policies that we've had in that region, the policy difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, or at the very least a tonal shift between the two in regards to administration, the need for the Democratic Party to create such a stark contrast to Donald Trump, that the moment that Trump is gone, for all intents and purposes, it looks as if there's a flag saying border open. There's all sorts of these things that are coming into play in regards to why all of these kids are coming at the border. But the one thing that mainstream media seems is like a red bar on the door for them ever even touching, is our influence in South America. I mean, Evo Morales wasn't just cooed by his own government. There's documents coming from like Telesur where they're talking about trying to use the OAS as a means of getting rid of Evo Morales in a similar way to which they got rid of Evo Morales. And when you're looking at Zelaya, the OAS was also used to get rid of him. Seems like there's a pattern here. I'm making a point that if you can never really interrogate why these places are basket cases or why these places are dumpster fires and whether or not you have something to do with it, then you can never get to the root of why the people are coming to the border in the first place. And that seems to be the thing that can never be touched, can never be discussed, or can never be brought up. Am I wrong on this, Shane? I watched news all week. I mean, at the very least all day Saturday. Why they're coming, our role in them coming, is not something that is typically touched. Even the sanctions that are put on the various countries. Honduras, for example, turned into a basket case. 80% of the cocaine that was coming through South America was coming through Honduras. This was after Hillary Clinton assisted in the coup, getting rid of his lives. Is that a success? And if that's a success, what does a failure look like? And if that is indeed a failure, can't you acknowledge that that was a failure? And if you can't acknowledge that was a failure, how do you ever get to the root of why all of these people are coming to the border? Shane, am I wrong on this?
Well, we've kept the Honduran government from being as disobedient as we feared the other administration would have been. And that seems to be the primary goal, whether it's with a hand around their throat or a collar on their neck. It's easier to control somebody when you have a grip on them. And it's easier to have a grip on somebody when you choose them. I don't know how else to put it. When you have, you put them in place, et cetera. And that's what we try to do very consistently. That's what we try to do by hook or by crook, by outright war, or more often by attempted coups and massive ongoing long-scale sanctions. That's what we try to do. Anyway, back to you, Jamarl. I think you're muted.
My bad. Like I said, that's unfortunate because part of my thought as I watched over the weekend was, this is why we're here. This is why Radio Sputnik, that's why Fault Lines exists. Because they can't say that. We can say that. And I would even go so far as to say that's why they don't give us interviews. Because they would never get asked those questions by mainstream media. Mainstream media would never bring that up. And so if Psaki or Price or somebody else from the State Department that is sitting there and they're asking questions, they know that they're never going to get a question with that framing. Because that framing is an indictment.
Okay, so I agree, but I also disagree on the one hand. In the Venezuela clip that we keep playing where Ned Price is asked, do we do coups? I'm oversimplifying, but only very slightly. Basically, did we do a coup in Venezuela? Is that what that was? He gets asked that question. He just refuses to respond. He filibusters by giving the most vague BS you can for the next minute, and then follows up for the minute after that when the dude clarifies, okay, yes, you did a coup, basically. Now, what you could do, and this is, so I'm disagreeing. They do get asked questions like that. What you could do is, in the exact same question, you sort of pack a couple of facts into that question. So you bring up the fact that, we have done sanctions on Venezuela consistently. You include those in the question, and then you sort of pivot from the question. So anybody who's replaying that or who's listening to it suddenly has a couple of leads to go on. They have your context sort of fit their mind into, and whether they accept it or not, they can get more of where you're coming from, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, but they don't talk about it in terms of coups. What they say is, hey, are you still on the path of trying to get rid of Maduro? That's the way they would ask. They would never talk about that as a coup. That's kind of my point. The coup doesn't fit in the context of the U.S. vocabulary.
The dude in the question did. I believe the dude in the Venezuela question that we keep playing literally uses the word coup. And then Ned Price responds by saying, well, we support the peaceful democratic, transition.
I can pull it up. I'm almost certain coup doesn't show up in that question. I'm almost certain. Oh, you've added, man, this is going to have to be fact checked. I was, and it depends on the day that you're talking. If you're talking about like the 13th or 11th or 12th. Oh, but we got to end these. Man, you've added the thing. I'm almost certain he didn't say coup, but if I did, I'll look it up. Oh, we got to find that up. All right, those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back with a fact check to figure out whether that question was asked or whether that question was not.
You're right. Real quick. I just pulled it up and listened to it. He uses the phrase regime change, which in my mind is almost synonymous with coup, but that's the phrase he uses.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Because I have been reading that thing for the past 2 days because I was like, I'm stunned that people just let him say stuff like this and never get pushback. Like, he's like, there is no spoon. And they write down, there is no spoon. He does that for an hour. And so it's like, yeah, all right. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I appreciate that, Shane. You're a bigger man. I appreciate that. We'll be back in a moment with Peter Oliver.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. You guys definitely help this show make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So NATO eventually, again, joined to prevent the Red Menace. And in being joined to prevent the Red Menace, you had a situation where eventually that Red Menace, the Soviet Union, falls apart. NATO, however, continues to go on. It doesn't necessarily have a purpose. It always looks for a purpose, and yet it's still there. What is the menace that is protecting us from? What's also interesting is the way this intersects with needs and real needs. And meaning, if those countries are in need of something, and yet they're still keeping the specter of a menace, how do both of those things fit together? And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because all of these things are intersecting from the standpoint of Nord Stream 2, basically the pipeline that Germany wants and Russia wants, that the United States is not on board for. This is a really good conversation about politics in regards to what countries want. And yet, the realities, or let's say the conceptions that these guys perpetuate that run in conflict with what they want. Joining us to have a conversation about this, and this gets into German politics, Russian politics, and the U.S. purview of that, exceeding not just from the Trump administration, but also persisting into the Biden administration. And we're talking about Nord Stream 2. The guest that we're going to have a conversation with this is Peter Oliver. He's an EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, thank you for joining us, man. You're a great person to talk to about this.
Oh, dear me, you've set me up for a fall there, Jamarl. Okay.
Oh, no. I promise you. You're perfect for this. So, Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 has been fascinating to me. Now, I'm going to give you, and basically just think of it as a basic summary. Nord Stream 2 is a pipeline that is trying to provide gas between Russia and Germany. The United States is against this. Germany needs it because of its basically lack of energy reserves, and Russia has the energy, wants to provide it. And the United States has gone so far as to put sanctions to prevent this from going through on the various companies. Peter, take a listen to this clip, because this is Ned Price, and he's given the U.S. perspective on Nord Stream 2. I find this clip phenomenal. Let's play the clip.
And the Secretary said several times that you guys were still looking into what other sanctions could be applied under the PISA and PISCA laws. And I'm just curious if there has been any further determinations made on that since your report that came out, considering the fact that the Danish Maritime Authority has actually identified at least 3 other ships that are working on the pipeline, which would be sanctioned. They should be sanctioned under U.S. law. They publicly identified them, and so I guess my question is, why haven't these other ships been sanctioned? And because they haven't, is this something that's in the works?
Matt, I'll read you what Secretary Blinken.
You didn't need to repeat what he said at the hearing yesterday.
But I think it's important. He made the point, and he said, "I've been on the job, I think, 5 weeks. The pipeline is 95% complete. It started construction in 2018. So I wish we didn't find ourselves in this situation with a pipeline that's virtually complete." All that notwithstanding, the President of the United States, Secretary Blinken, others in this government have made this administration's view unavowedly, unambiguously clear that Nord Stream 2 is a bad idea. It goes against Europe's own stated energy interests. It goes against our interests in the region as well. That's precisely why in the report that we submitted to Congress under the legislation that was passed and consistent with the legislation that was passed, we noted our sanctions on KVT Rus and the Fortuna. As you know, Matt, these reports are due to Congress every 90 days. During that 90-day period, we will continue to evaluate the pipelaying activity that is ongoing in the region. If this activity meets
Let's stop right there for a moment, because Ned Price, I swear, man, he has a tendency to talk for like 5 minutes in order to give you 20 seconds of information. Basically, the U.S. is not on board for it, and more sanctions are coming down the pipe. That's what it sounds like. However, they accept that 95% of it is done.
Yep. That pipe being the longest underwater pipe in the world, Nord Stream 2, when it's going to be finished. 95, I think it's actually a little bit more than that, done. We are expecting in May, from this side anyway, this side of the Atlantic here in Germany, what we understand is in May there will be an announcement when it comes to individuals and entities that are facing sanctions. I mean, the thing is that this pipeline is going to be completed. By May, I'm not sure whether it would have reached the area in Greifswald where it's supposed to be coming into it, Lubmin in Germany. I'm not sure whether it will have reached there. But the thing is this thing's almost done. It's almost finished. Whether it's going to be stopped or not, it's not going to be stopped. It's going to be finished. The questions are, how is it going to be used? And you've got pretty much a continuation of what was going on under the Trump administration with the Biden administration, that they're not happy with it. They don't like it. The reasons they don't like it is, well, they're political in some sense. They're diplomatic in some sense. Both Republicans and Democrats in the United States have said that this would put Russian infrastructure on NATO territory, increasing European dependence on Russian gas. That's by the by, but Russia is the cheapest place that can provide the most reliable source of gas to Germany, and from there on to the rest of Europe. The United States would love to be able to sell Germany its liquefied natural gas. In fact, we were talking about a month ago, a little bit longer, about a deal that was supposedly in the offing with the Trump administration, in which Germany would buy €1 billion worth of liquefied natural gas from the US. It seems like that's not enough in order to stop the continuation of these sanctions. We're just waiting to see exactly how they're going to be put across, because it will ultimately involve the United States sanctioning companies, individuals, entities that belong to its allies.
This just seems so astonishing to me. I think that's the catch. We're sanctioning allies over this, and they're making a choice that's in their energy needs. Now, does the United States have a point? And how does Germany justify this? Because based on the prevailing idea of this, Germany is basically dancing between the raindrops. They're letting their reality, the need of their reality, intercede upon this kind of narrative of the Russian menace. And what I mean by that is, does the United States have a point? If indeed Russia is a menace, and if indeed they're on the brink of, taking Germany and taking Poland and taking all of these other countries, then how are you getting enemies or oil from an enemy? Meaning, how are you basically saying both things are true at once? This country is somebody who we're terrified of, who we think is going to come and get us at any particular moment. However, we're going to get a vital resource from this country. How does Angela Merkel justify that position?
At the very height of the Cold War, at the worst possible moments in the early 80s, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, bought gas from the USSR. This has happened for a long time.
No way.
They don't see there was huge problems back then with the United States saying that they shouldn't be doing it, but they did, because it was the necessary way in order to fulfill the gas needs that were there. That's why there is this huge gas infrastructure that goes from what's now Russia, which obviously was then part of the Russian Republic in the Soviet Union, the vast majority of that infrastructure takes gas currently across Ukraine. This is where we get into the sticking points. So from Germany's point of view, it's done. This pipeline's built. It's almost there. They've offered to buy the liquefied natural gas from the US to try and say, look, just let's let this slide. We're going to buy all this from you. They've offered to make sure that Ukraine isn't cut out of the gas transit. Now, this is a big thing, of course, because during Maidan, I was there in Kiev. The speeches from the stage by John McCain and by other people from Catherine Ashton from the EU were very much, if you do this, we will support you, and we will support
you were there.
In terms
Wait,
of
Peter, did you say that you were?
I was. Yes, I was in Ukraine. I was in Maidan, and I was in Donbass.
We've got to talk about that at some point.
We can
I'm sorry
do
for
that.
cutting in.
Get me onto. No, not a problem. So one of the things that they've insisted one of the things the German side have said, as far as this offer they're trying to make to the United States to stop sanctions, is we'll make sure that Ukraine isn't cut out of the gas transit. We'll also help Ukraine diversify the gas transit infrastructure so that they could be the route for hydrogen transfer, say, from Russia. They could also try and help invest in green energy technologies. So far, this hasn't been enough to win over either the Trump administration or currently the Biden administration, to make them go, actually, yeah, that's a good enough deal. We're going to stop these sanctions. Now, the cards are being played very close to the chest. Now, I know we were having a bit of a smile about what the chap from the State Department was saying there, but it's pretty similar message coming from the Foreign Ministry here in Berlin. They've said that they're in contact with the US government regarding sanctions, but these talks are private. All of the mood music, of course, coming out of Washington is that as far as Joe Biden is concerned, the US president sees this as a clear example of Russia's aggression and aggressive action, I beg your pardon, he said, in the region. Russia, as far as the US is concerned, wants to use gas for influence in Europe. Now, Europe needs that energy. Europe needs this energy. It's not whether that it will be used for some kind of nefarious influence. If we don't do this, we're going to cut off your power. Well, we haven't ever seen that. The only times we've seen the gas being cut off to Europe was, we've seen it a couple of times with Ukraine, where they haven't been paying the bills that they were supposed to pay, and Gazprom and turned off the gas flow that was going through Ukraine, because it's the same thing. If I didn't, or either of you guys, I'm presuming this is how it works in the US, if I didn't pay my gas bill, if I didn't pay my electricity bill, the company would turn it off after a bit. Ukraine wasn't paying the bills when it came to that, so the gas was turned off. That knock-on effect that it had, of course, was that gas then didn't reach Europe. This is the only times we've seen this before. So the idea that it would be used for these nefarious purposes doesn't really bear out. Obviously, the potential is there. It is a thing that's there. But as we've said before, this isn't a new thing. Gas coming from Russia to Europe has been going on for a long, long time. What happens next is, well, I think ultimately Germany's going to have to, this is going to continue until Germany makes an offer to the United States, at which point the US will go, oh, well, it's almost finished now, but look, we've won because we've made Germany and Russia come to these concessions in which...
I mean, this is so sad, though. I mean, basically, this is sanctions that didn't work, that at the end of the process... I mean, what are they going to do? Keep the sanctions on forever? Like, it's just going to be punitive like in Cuba? Like, we're just going to keep this up for 50 years because you guys built the pipeline and we didn't like the fact that you built the pipeline. Like, at a certain point, this gets a certain level of ridiculous.
If you listen to Ted Cruz, sorry if you're talking over you, Jamarl, if you listen to Ted Cruz, who's the guy who's the co-author of these sanctions, yeah, he's happy to keep these in place. He's holding up Antony Blinken's and Joe Biden's nominations for posts in the State Department at the moment, saying that and he's offering them the quid pro quo, you make sure Nord Stream 2 stops, or you put these sanctions in place properly, then I'll free up your nominations.
Bitter enders.
Because as far as
bitter enders. That's so sad. That's so sad. The pipeline is 95% complete.
Nord Stream 2.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like 95% complete, and these guys are still like, we just need one more sanction. They'll do it. We just sanction one more company. The voice that you guys are listening to is Peter Oliver. He's EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. We're going to be back with Peter in a moment for German local elections. And despite the fact that they're local, they may have far larger significance in regards to what is coming up in policy for the national elections that are coming up. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to cash them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory, or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We, perched at the edge of the world, get to pay attention to all sorts of elections, even local elections that are taking place in far-off lands. Germany is not a far-off land. It's across the pond in a few steps. But typically, we don't necessarily cover local elections, if I'm being entirely honest. But we do cover those local elections when those local elections have a larger significance on an international scale or have a larger meaning. Well, Angela Merkel is stepping down after 16 years. And there are national elections that are coming up. And it's unclear whether or not Angela Merkel's power is going to transfer to whoever else takes her spot. And for that matter, whether or not her party, the CDU, which is looking not great these days, will be able to maintain the level of power that they have when she's gone. In order to have a conversation about the local elections and how those local elections panned out, we're joined by Peter Oliver. He's EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, we were having a conversation about this last time you were here, and I think you were making a point that the Greens were set to basically clean up, and that Angela Merkel's party, the CDU, is not looking good in regards to taking over in the next and upcoming elections, especially if these local elections end up going to the Greens. I think the Greens cleaned up, or did they? You tell us. How did these local elections turn out, and what is the expectation for the upcoming nationals?
So these were elections in the German states of Baden-Württemberg and the Rhineland-Palatinate. Now, when you say the Greens cleaned up, yeah, in Baden-Württemberg, they've won there. They've taken the largest share. Winfried Kretschmann who's pretty much the governor, to try and translate it into US terms of politics, of the state of Baden-Württemberg. He's being returned. He's also probably the most powerful Green Party politician anywhere in the world. They've won very well there. Now, in Rhineland-Palatinate, they've posted about 8.5% of the vote, but what that does is it gets them a chance to be part of a state government there. Now, what we're seeing is a trend amongst those who would vote in the centre ground, drifting a little bit away from the Christian Democratic Union Party and towards the Greens. Now, it is the Ides of March today, 15th of March, and there's a lot of talk going on about attempts to, well, I don't want to say stab in the back because it's an election, it's a vote, this is how it works. But these parties in Baden-Württemberg, the Greens were previously in a coalition with the Christian Democratic Union. In Rhineland-Palatinate, it was the Social Democrats from the centre-left that were in a coalition with the Christian Democratic Union. Quite a bit of talk right now about what if they decided not to be this time around. If they went for a coalition between the Greens, the Free Democrats, who are a liberal pro-business party, and the Social Democrats in both. It's called a traffic light coalition because the colours are red, green, and yellow, amber, for the different parties. Now, if they were to do that and they were to cut the CDU out of government in those states, then people will seriously start talking about, well, hang on, what if they did this at the Bundestag election in September? And that will cause a lot of consternation because the CDU and the Christian Social Union, this conservative bloc, they're still polling, I'll get there in the end, at around 30% nationally. Now, that's all right, but it is the lowest that they've been in a year. The popularity in the CDU seems to be centered around Angela Merkel personally. And now, as we said, she's stepping down at this election. Who will actually be running as the candidate to replace her for that party? Still not 100% certain whether it would be Armin Laschet, who's basically the governor of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, or whether it would be Markus Söder, who's in the same position in the state of Bavaria. Armin Laschet set to take over. He's the heir apparent at the moment. He's the head of the Christian Democratic Union Party. But what we may well see is if they lose a few more of these local elections, or they lose out in some of these local elections, because we have to point out these results from Sunday night in Baden-Württemberg and Rhineland-Palatinate, they're historic lows. They've never posted these type of low numbers.
But why? Why is it so low? Like, what's Angela Merkel, from my understanding, is still popular, relatively so. And even though she's leaving, it seems like none of that popularity translates at all to the party. Meaning, is it not about policy at all? It's just about personality, and that personality is leaving. Is that what it is? Like, is it really that straightforward?
And the whiff of corruption in the air, Jamal. We've had a corruption scandal here in Germany that has, it would seem, affected the CDU more than they certainly would have hoped. It's all about pandemic profiteering. That there's 3 MPs two from the Christian Democratic Union, 1 from the Christian Social Union, who've had to resign, get out, clear your desks immediately, do not pass go, do not collect $200, get away from the party as far as you can, because they were caught making money or for being the middleman or lobbying for different companies when it came to masks and PPE during the pandemic. Now, last Friday, by 1800, close of business on Friday, everybody who was standing for any position anywhere in the CDU or CSU had to return to party headquarters a letter saying, I have not done anything that made me any money because of the pandemic.
Oh, that's brutal.
We don't know if everybody returned that, but this is not a scandal that's going away. And there are still now questions being asked about further afield, not just the pandemic, who's made what money. Now, they've been in power for 16 years, the Christian Democratic Union. Now, that's the phrase is pork barrel politics, isn't it, in the US?
It is. Well, but also in the US, we might have
16 years.
We might run it on a slightly faster timescale because the national elections in Germany are all the way out in September, about 6 months from now. And while corruption allegations of that level would have some sticking power, I bet they wouldn't fade away completely. But other stuff would, other news items would take over, other perspectives would predominate. Do you see that happening, or from what you're saying, I'm guessing not. I'm guessing you think those will continue to linger, those will affect them even half a year out, Peter.
They do not do corruption scandals here. This is the no of no-nos of the worst of the worst. When I say these 3 politicians have stood down, and I made a bit of a song and dance about it, I can't emphasize it enough. They have been ostracized, and they're out.
I hear you.
Being close to them is toxic. So I would suggest if there's the strongest hint of anything that can be backed up that anybody was involved in that, it's going to affect people. And
Peter, we've got to close the segment a little bit early in just a couple of minutes. So I want to use the time we have to pivot to the Greens. Right now, I mean, just looking from the 19th Bundestag over the last couple of years, they're at the back of the pack in terms of the number of seats in the Bundestag. How did Sunday's elections change that? And what do you see coming for the Greens later on this year during the national elections?
they're going to be the vote of the middle class. They're going to be the vote of those that would be looking for the center ground, those that would like to think of themselves as center left, but who are really center right, particularly economically. They're seen as being very strong on foreign policy. They're particularly in line with conservative policies when it comes to NATO. They're very big fans of that in some ways, but not in others. They're big fans of a stronger line being taken against Russia. They're going to pick up they're basically in direct competition for the CDU, and they don't have a corruption scandal. So they're going to be very, very interesting to see how they come about. They may well be in government come the end of September with the CDU. How much of a coalition partner depends on how many votes they get.
And say we were to see, and I want to come full circle. We've got about a minute left after this.
Oh, okay.
Coming full circle, say we were to see a black-green coalition on Nord Stream 2, on what is, I'm sure, a major political bone of contention in German politics. How would you see a black-green government dealing with that issue? How would it change from the current policy by the German government, which, as Jamarl seems to, as he put it, seems to be dancing between the raindrops, trying to continue with this deal while dealing with, significant domestic and foreign opposition?
If it's Armin Laschet or Markus Söder who's the chancellor, then probably not that much. It won't make that much of a difference because they're going to toe the continuity line of Angela Merkel. Laschet certainly more so than Markus Söder, but
1 minute.
Not really fancy running if he starts seeing that the CDU lose a few more of these local elections, because ultimately he wouldn't want to take the risk of trying to run for chancellor and not getting it. So if it was either of those two, though, I think you're most likely going to see it continue, but it's going to continue with a lot of infighting, and I wouldn't be surprised if some real restrictions on Nord Stream 2 were part of any coalition agreement between the CDU
implemented by
and
that.
the Greens.
I hear you.
Yep.
And we'll have to come back a little bit closer to talk about that. We were joined, Peter, thank you for joining us. We're joined by Peter Oliver, the EU correspondent for RT International. He provides daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we will be back on the other side in just a minute with our next guest, KJ No, talking about Myanmar, giving you an update on the situation in Myanmar. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for a great conversation on Myanmar. He has informed our opinion on this particular subject greatly, and he is bound to do so again. KJ No. KJ No is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon, is now available at iacenter.org. KJ, thank you for joining us. I want to get directly into what has been taking place from the standpoint of the latest in Myanmar. There have been a large number of people that have basically died recently, even as late as recently as today. 5 people were apparently killed today, if I'm not mistaken, or 12 over the weekend, with a number that seems to be increasing. The public doesn't necessarily seem to be taking this lying down. And what's more interesting in this, I think, has to do with the idea of democracy, and Suu Kyi coming in as a democratic leader. And then with the elections that basically go in large measure to her party, even though they were called fraudulent. It seems that the public is looking at this from a perspective of once having it, not wanting to give it up. And that's why it seems so difficult to put down the public and its resistance to this coup. Is that what it is? That the moment that they were able to taste this notion of we have some agency, we have some choice in the direction of this country, that is not something they want to give up, even to the degree of losing lives to defend it.
Yes, it's complex, but yes, certainly what you're saying is correct. There were 12 deaths on Saturday, including 5, if I'm not mistaken, in Mandalay, and Sunday there've been between 5 and 28 deaths. So, the death toll is not yet confirmed. But this has to do with the fact that this is the anniversary of the death of a student in 1988 at the Rangoon Institute of Technology. This was kind of like their Kent State moment, and that resulted in a massive uprising against the military in 88 that resulted in at least 3,000 killed, possibly more. So this is the anniversary of that, and of course there have been massive protests against the military coup, and as a result of that, we see this, massive bloodshed. What is interesting right now is, as you point out, the shifts that are happening. There is the acting vice president of the NLD, Man Win Kang Tam. He has declared essentially a government in exile or a government in hiding. The CRPH, the Commission for Representing the Union Parliament. And he's calling for solidarity with all the armed ethnic organizations. Now remember, Myanmar has 21 armed ethnic organizations. Some of these are powerful armies that have actually held onto large areas of liberated territory inside Myanmar itself. They've essentially, stalemated the military. Now, Man himself is a Karen, so he's an ethnic minority, and he's also a Christian, which is an interesting development. He was just a legislator before, but now the NLD has made him acting vice president, and he's made this call for a federal democracy, and he's calling for a revolution. So this is clearly an appeal to the armed ethnic organizations to join the fray. We'll see how this pans out, because we have to watch out. We have to see how the AEOs respond. And my feeling is they will not all be on board. And the other point is that we'll have to see whether this government in exile is recognized. So these are some of the factors going on right now.
The AEOs that you're talking about, the armed ethnic organizations, you say that not all of them are necessarily lumping themselves in with Man's cause. How many show signs of doing so? And if they were to do that, I mean, with the military coup government pushing back against them, they would be pushing back specifically against ethnic groups. If that goes overboard, if they go overboard in their response, that could very quickly turn into allegations of genocide, because again, these are along ethnic lines. I'm trying to throw in a couple of different sort of topics here, but KJ, what's your take on that generally? Where do you see that going? I mean, if it continues, if it accelerates into an ethnic conflict where it was formerly just a sort of a political one between the military and the leadership of Myanmar, what are your concerns and what prospects does that open up in terms of the political development of Myanmar?
Well, I think it pushes the country towards more and more chaos. I already mentioned, that this is really a crossfire hurricane. And, regarding the charges of genocide, I mean, it's not unreasonable to state that genocide is already happening against the ethnic minorities. I mean, at the very least, an ethnic cleansing. We know, in Rakhine State, of course, we had, the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya, but also there are 200,000 Rakhine who have been displaced, 200,000, Rakhine IDPs. And the Karen, that's somewhere between 100 to 400,000 that have also been displaced. So this has been ongoing. And these death rates that we're talking about right now, although they seem, horrific, and they are, they have been happening daily against the ethnic minorities as well. Now, to complexify the issue is the fact that, for example, one of the largest armed ethnic organizations is the Arakan Army. This is a Buddhist, this is the armed ethnic organization representing the Buddhist minorities in Rakhine State. And they are between 50 and 100,000 strong. They are a serious, contender for power. And what's interesting is that the Burmese military has just stated that the Arakan Army is no longer a terrorist organization. In other words, they're seeing, the Rakhine as a potential ally. And of course, this is the complexity of it, is that the NLD, which is primarily a Burmese majority political party, has, for the most part, excluded the ethnic minorities from having a really inclusive governance. And now that they have been cracked down on the military that they were holding to their chest, now they're reaching out to the ethnic communities. I think that it will be a very complex chessboard.
With both sides, KJ, with both sides reaching out to ethnic minorities. I just wanted to come in one quick comment on the Arakan Buddhist militias that you're talking about. 50 to 100,000 strong. Those are large numbers. Aren't they also known as perpetrators historically of the violence against the Rohingya? Weren't they, along with the government, some of the most prominent enactors of violence that led to the Rohingya refugee crisis and how most people would have heard about Myanmar over the last, say, half decade period?
The Arakan Army was formed in 2005. Its early beginnings were in 2005. It really didn't operationalize until much, much later. And the persecution against the Rohingya has been ongoing since the beginning of the Burmese state. The main force oppressing both the Rakhine Buddhists and the Rohingya has been the Burmese military. So I don't think that's an accurate portrayal. But of course, there have been clashes between ARSA, which is considered to be ISIS-aligned army that is related to the Rohingya and the Arakan Army. So once again, a very complex situation. We're looking at a diverse, complex chessboard, many factors playing, and the possibility for massive chaos. Right now, as we speak, there is. It looks like the Karen look to be, taking up arms against the Burmese military. They always have, but
and just to make this a little bit more complex, the vision of Suu Kyi. I mean, basically, yes, a democratic figure, but there are reports that she was far more adamant with going after the Rohingyas and even the military itself. I mean, you could speak on that, on whether those reports were true. I mean, some of the conversation and some of the stuff that I read, it was even concerns that she was taking so much power that she was becoming almost like a dictator in and of herself, meaning trending in that direction. Like, it's not as, it's strange. She's considered a democratic figure, but by the same token, some of the actions that she's taken is considered this kind of consolidation of power. Before we get into additional charges, do you want to speak on that one for a moment?
Yes, well, the charges are clearly, they're just trying to pile anything on. It's the typical overcharging that you see in courts in the United States. They're trying to throw something and see if it will stick. So the most recent charges is that she's taken $600,000 in bribes and 11 kilograms of gold. That's, very, odd in its specificity. So, they want to maintain her detention. They want to put pressure on her. But as you point out, once again, Aung San Suu Kyi was a flawed figure, clearly a politician. She had, large ambitions. When her party won in 2015, she took on 5 cabinet positions, 5 ministries for herself as a single individual. I mean, there's a kind of oversized ambition there, as well as being designated state councilor, which is, extra constitutional leader of the country. She's not the president because the Constitution forbids her from doing that. And she did dial back on some of the ministry positions because she's not qualified to hold all of those positions by herself. But she was clearly a flawed individual. She held the military too close to her, banking on her father's relations with the military. Her father founded the military itself. And yes, she was intimately responsible for the crackdown on the Rohingya and the Rakhine. Partly, if for no other reason, that a lot of the repression was not simply military. It was a fourfold strategy. It was no food, no information, no recruitment, and no funding. It was a very coordinated strategy. And that kind of coordinated strategy involves the cooperation of all the ministries.
We only have about a minute left. Thank you for joining us, and thank you again for the great overview. One of the latest bits of news coming out is that a number of Chinese factories, I've seen as few as 2 and as many as 10, a number of Chinese factories were set ablaze and hit. Again, these are Chinese-funded factories in Myanmar. It's unclear who's responsible, but nevertheless, one of the larger sort of global issues we've been weighing on this is if the United States or the UN or China decided to get involved, what that would look like. How much more likely do you think it is at this point that China will decide to get involved if factories they funded are being harmed? KJ?
Well, the Chinese have asked or called for an end to the violence. My understanding is that there are 4 garment factories and a fertilizer plant that have been set on fire, and also attacks on Chinese staff. And this is a very interesting tactic. This is the kind of tactic we saw in Hong Kong, was that there was a blocking of the fire engines trying to put out the fire by quote-unquote protesters. And there's also been damaging of rail lines in Kachin State and threats to destroy pipelines. So clearly, there is an indigenous resistance to a coup, tremendous anger, and also there's weaponization through a kind of milk tea color revolution alliance that clearly the U.S. or the NED is supporting. You see this in the, massive English signs. Most people in Myanmar don't speak English, but all their protest signs are in English.
For an English audience, and that's one of the larger points. Exactly. KJ, right. I'm cutting in because we're out of time. Thank you again for joining us. We never have enough time to go into detail, but we're always glad to have you on to talk about it. For those listening, KJ No is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, it's available now at iacenter.org. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back in a minute with headlines in the last hour of today's show.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour of this morning's show, the most disruptive show covering news, events, and politics across our divided country and the surface of our fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I hope your morning continues to go well. Let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, at least 572 new coronavirus deaths and 38,034 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there have been an average of 54,832 cases per day. That's a decrease of 19% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of this morning, more than 29,461,600 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. Over 534,000 have died from it. Parents of school children protested in several cities around the United States over the weekend, frustrated by the off-again, on-again reopening policies in some school districts. Several hundred people rallied in downtown Naperville, Illinois on Sunday. In San Francisco and Pan Pacific Park in Los Angeles, hundreds of parents and children marched on Saturday, all of them in support of a 5-day in-person schedule. Teachers' unions have largely continued advocating slower reopenings to keep educators safe, with some unions saying access to vaccinations was a requirement before returning to schools. Teachers are now eligible for vaccinations in all states. Los Angeles, Seattle, and Portland all saw clashes between crowds and police Saturday night as demonstrators marked the one-year anniversary of Breonna Taylor's death in a police raid in Louisville, Kentucky. At least one officer was injured in Saturday's clashes. It was unclear if any protesters were injured. Taylor's family and their supporters have been seeking the prosecution of city police officers who participated in the raid that led to Taylor's death. 3 police officers have been fired, and 1 detective was charged for allegedly shooting into adjacent apartments during the raid, but none has been charged in connection with Taylor's death. Authorities in Kentucky stress that their investigation is continuing. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas announced he has ordered FEMA to help U.S. immigration officials receive and shelter migrant minors crossing the southern border without parents or legal guardians for the next 90 days. Children detained at a Customs and Border Protection holding facility in South Texas told lawyers they were being held in overcrowded conditions. Children also reported having to sleep on the floor, not being able to call family members, having limited access to showers, and not seeing sunlight in nearly a week. In addition to the FEMA deployment, Mayorkas said officials from other Department of Homeland Security agencies, including the Federal Protective Service and U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, were also providing assistance with shelter operations and security. DHS said the marked rise in border crossings could be attributed to poverty, violence, and food insecurity in Central America. Of course, my follow-up quick addendum, what would be causing the poverty, violence, and food insecurity? I mean, I guess there are multiple factors, but I can't help but think that the United States policies toward these countries, including ongoing coup attempts and sanctions, might contribute a bit, but we tend to leave that out of our verbal calculus. 11 U.S. states have joined forces in an attempt to intervene in a lawsuit to challenge a decision by the administration of President Joe Biden, trying to overturn an immigration policy set in place by predecessor Donald Trump. The suit has been filed in a number of states, issued in 2019 and in effect in most states nationwide. Trump's policy had radically expanded the list of programs to consider when determining if a person is likely to become a public charge, which restricted immigrants perceived as reliant on welfare from receiving green cards. The Biden administration announced recently it would stop defending the rule, stating it was, quote, neither in the public interest nor an efficient use of limited government resources, end quote. Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich said in a statement, quote, it is unconscionable to overwhelm our infrastructure and immigration personnel when we are dealing with the health and economic devastation of the pandemic. While regardless of one's position on immigration reform, this reckless violation of federal law is only creating another national crisis and putting additional strains on our state and hardworking Arizona taxpayers, end quote. The Alabama Republican Party will honor former President Trump for being, quote, one of the greatest and most effective presidents in the 245-year history of this republic, end quote. At a Saturday evening reception held at Mar-a-Lago, the party will present Trump with a framed resolution that grants him the honor. Jamarl, I hear you laughing.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, man, that's too conspicuous.
Just say that he's like God King Trump. Just say he's the greatest man to ever walk the earth. Why even play around with this part? Just go all the way out.
They were wielding the golden idol. There was a golden idol.
Right. You already had the golden idol. Why back away from the golden idol? He's the greatest man alive. He's the greatest American alive. Just go there.
Start making sacrifices in his honor. I think that's the next step. And then it's human sacrifices, maybe Aztec style. I don't know.
That is great, anyway. Man. Like that's great. That's awesome. That's epic. That's just epic. I love that. Look, you can make a resolution about anything. Just say it. Look, we think Trump is the greatest man, the greatest American ever walked the face of the earth. Period. That's our resolution. That's where we're going with. We got the golden idol. We're going to put the golden idol here in Mar-a-Lago Ranch, and we're just going to go with that.
Technically, they're saying he's one of the greatest and most effective presidents. They're not putting him at the top of the list, but I'm sure for many, they're just looking that way. What the hell are you talking about? Myself included. No, he's not. What the hell are you talking about? Anyway.
I love their modesty.
Minneapolis.
The guy got 500,000 people killed. I love the modesty.
What a shining example, so to speak. The Minneapolis City Council has approved a $27 million settlement with the family of George Floyd. From the settlement, $500,000 will go to funding community programs near the intersection where he died. The family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city in July, accusing officers of, quote, unjustified, excessive, and illegal and deadly use of force, end quote. The suit sought to make it financially prohibitive for officers to kill marginalized people and black people in the future in America. The family also called on Minneapolis police to reform and break the python grip of the force's union contract, and for Congress to pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, a bill that would ban chokeholds and reform qualified immunity for officers, making it easier to bring misconduct cases against the police. Settlement will not affect the ongoing criminal case against Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis police officer charged with murdering Floyd. The county court began seating jurors earlier this week in the trial of Chauvin, who faces second-degree murder and manslaughter charges, as well as a recently added third-degree murder charge. 6 of 14 jurors have been seated. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat from California, repeatedly affirmed Sunday that she has zero tolerance for sexual harassment, but she did not call on New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to resign. Well, what does zero tolerance mean then? I mean, you're tolerating it. I don't know how else to put it. Anyway, nearly 90% of New York's congressional delegation has called for the governor's resignation or impeachment, as have more than 80% of state senators. Last week, the state assembly initiated what could be the first step toward impeachment by opening an investigation with full subpoena power into sexual misconduct allegations against the governor and his handling of COVID-19 at nursing homes. When asked whether he agreed with other Democrats calling for Cuomo's immediate resignation, Biden said, quote, I think the investigation is underway and we should see what it brings us, end quote. In international news, a Biden admin official who spoke on condition of anonymity said the White House had reached out to Kim Jong-un, quote, through several channels starting in mid-February, including in New York, end quote, and that to date, quote, we have not received any response from Pyongyang, end quote. Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State Antony Blinken are expected to meet with officials in Japan and South Korea next week. Those meetings will most likely highlight concerns about North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Former Bolivian interim president Janine Áñez was arrested on Saturday after the country's attorney general's office issued arrest warrants the previous day against Áñez and 5 ministers from her former cabinet. Áñez published on her Twitter account images of what she says are the 6 pages of the arrest warrant, which lists charges of terrorism, conspiracy, and sedition. She also wrote that, quote, in an act of abuse and political persecution, the MAS, Movement Toward Socialism government, has ordered my arrest. It is accusing me of having participated in a coup that never happened, end quote. Political tensions in Bolivia have been high ever since the contested 2019 election/coup, in which former President Evo Morales was declared winner, but international watchdogs alleged the results were fraudulent and the election was annulled. Áñez was interim president for less than a year and vowed to hold a new presidential election, which took place in October 2020. Luis Arce, the MAS candidate supported by Morales, won a landslide victory in that election.
Wait, just so we're clear, how many points? It was over 10 points. Like, we have no conception of that. How many points did did Joe Biden beat Trump? Maybe like 3. 1, right? Yeah, it was small. Barely. And if we had Evo Morales won that election by over 10 points. He won it outright by over 10 points. An election that he won over 10 points, the OAS comes in and says, we think something's wrong with that. And then they go away. And all of a sudden, that is enough. Where the military kicks off, where all of these goons in the street kick off, like all of this stuff just kicks off at once. And Evo is basically told, but it's like, look, you need to leave because, you know, what are you going to do? Are you going to have a civil war? Are you about to get captured? What are you going to do? He left. He saved himself. And what ended up happening was this coup regime that took place for the last year that, attacked and killed indigenous. I mean, like these guys were maniacs. And so then the new government comes back in. Mas wins. Then the question becomes, what does Mas do? And my thought, as an American, well, those guys, that was a coup. You can't let that happen again. Not just can't let that happen again. Everybody that was involved with that needs to go to prison. Everybody that was involved in that needs to round up. And the moment that you do that, what are they going to say? Oh, he's having roundups. They're doing this and that. Like, my thinking of this is off. I have to think about this more like in a political sense. They have to find charges against her to prosecute her in a legal context. And the fact that she was part of a coup in and of itself is not enough to make that work. Does that make sense? Like, they're not treating this as if a coup government took place. They're treating this as if an interim government took place and gave it back. When everybody and their mama knows a coup. That's so wild. Like, the politics of this is so wild.
Like this. I'll put it like this. If China were to have alleged that in the 2020 presidential election, Trump had actually won, you know, he took home the vote, but there was election fraud in the United States. Basically, if China, out of absolutely nowhere, made the same allegations about the 2020 presidential election of election fraud that Trump did, and then, you know, they basically forced the United States government through international institutions to accept Trump as the victor. Okay, again, incredible.
And gangs roving the streets. The fascists are rolling the streets, making sure that this works from a military standpoint. The police are roaming the streets, making sure that works in a you know, especially the ones that are affiliated with the fascists. Like, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about minorities.
That would be historically noted forever. We would notate that as a coup forever, even under a Trump admin. Even if he had actually been put in place, the media, the bulk of it, would have called that a coup. I don't know how else to say it. But when the tables are turned, we don't want to admit to that because, of course, we were backing Inez's government. We don't like Morales.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
And
do you remember Elon Musk writes, "We can coup whoever we want." He says that nonsense because, of course, lithium, which is what Bolivia has a lot of, and they were making a deal with China because they wanted that lithium to be basically beneficial to the community on the country itself. Those were deals that he was making. That's how good of a president he is. That's why it bothered me so much when this happened. And I'm looking at this picture of her.
I feel like there's some nuance on Elon Musk. I feel like he's, I don't even know.
No, there may be nuance. I'm just saying I didn't like that comment. But especially since there were real people that were getting killed in the process of that.
At least somebody said it. That's the kind of thing that you can imagine Trump saying. And in a lifting of the veil sense, you know, it's a good thing to see happening. It's a good thing to see stated very clearly. And that's why I feel like I don't know how much of his tongue was in his cheek. I don't know, you know, how, you know, what his tenor was when he said that. But based on Elon Musk as a public figure, I don't care.
I see what you mean. I'm being unfair because he's a billionaire. I'm being biased. Look, I could be honest about that.
This was also after the coup, Musk transitioned and apparently is now pursuing lithium mining in Nevada. They're trying some new lithium.
So he's building his gigafactory there, probably.
Yes, exactly.
This tiny picture, of her in this tiny jail cell fills me with such joy.
Oh man,
that's sick, ain't it? That's sick. I'll accept that. I'll take it.
Unless it's Ghislaine Maxwell, I'm pretty hesitant. I don't know. Unless it's like a mass murderer or like a mass child pedophile, a mass pedophile, something like that. I don't know.
No, Shane, this is awesome. She's even wearing a little, it's like a diaper on her mouth, but it's a mask in the jail cell. It's a little tiny jail cell. It's like a tiny house.
You sound like some people in our chat room. No. Oh God. Jamarl. Anyway.
She was involved in a coup. There were people that were killed in that coup. Do you realize they took one of the people and dragged her in the street, dyed her hair, cut her hair? They were doing all the stuff. They went through Evo Morales' house, throwing stuff on the floor. When now look at how he's living. He's living the life of a rich man. Like they were doing this nonsense.
You're making the victim just sound like an average American millennial e-girl. I don't know. You dyed her hair, cut her hair. That doesn't sound that bad. We've got to close it here. You know what? I have to add these in. A couple of very quick headlines. Activists are reporting that Sunday was the deadliest day yet in Myanmar. At least 50 protesters killed. We had a great conversation with KJ No in the last segment. Go check that out. And in Saudi Arabia, foreign laborers are now able to switch jobs without receiving their employer's permission. This comes as a long demanded change to the country's labor laws. Although critics say the law change does not do enough. It's changing the kafala system in operation in most of the Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states specifically, and in neighboring countries anyway. Those are big changes, so I felt the need to throw those in. But those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a minute on the other side of this short break. Be right back.
Fault lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So, over the weekend, I had this opportunity to sit and watch the news explain, only partially, why there are so many unaccompanied kids at the border. And this conversation is often, typically, truncated. It goes something like, there's so many kids at the border. There are so many unaccompanied minors. There are 9,000 over the course of February. What is the president going to do? And they'll stop right there, and they'll look into the camera, and nobody will have any answers. And any notion of context on why there's so many kids are at the border doesn't necessarily apply. Because you must understand, the American perspective doesn't take into account this notion that we instigate coups. We're okay with dictators when those people are following our directives and are paying attention to us. For example, Saudi Arabia, do you honestly believe that MBS is not a dictator in the truest sense of the word, and that is not a theocracy? I am telling you it is. I can go over the course of time and show you the governments that we've knocked over, the dictators we put in, the people that we've offed, and none of this stuff, all of this stuff is on record as being legit and real, especially the responsibilities and the actions of the CIA over the course of God knows how many years. In this very specific context, though, I want to talk about the unaccompanied minors at the border, the contradictions that are associated in U.S. policy, and the thing that can't be discussed are sanctions and coups. And the wild part about it is you can't even discuss it in the context of trying to prevent more people from showing up at the border. Because if you go there, you're saying something that we do not engage ourselves in. Let's have a conversation. We're going to have a conversation with Kim Averson. Kim Averson is an independent journalist and host of the Kim Averson Show on YouTube. She's one of my favorite people. We always get into these really good conversations because she has her own point of view. She's an independent thinker, and that's why we bring her onto the show. Kim, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's like, oh man, he set me up for failure after that. Well,
Right.
I was wowed out by this because I watched Jen Psaki, I watched Ned Price, I watched all of these people talk about it. I watched the media talk about it. Oh my God, there's so many kids. There are 9,000 kids in February alone. What are we going to do? And Biden's policy on this is a contradiction. What they don't deal with is that Donald Trump basically said, stay out, period. And people were like, whoa, that guy's scary. And you also had COVID. And so immigration basically goes down to like little to nothing because if you're coming here, well, you're coming into a COVID pit. Donald Trump is basically making rules to keep people in Mexico. Joe Biden comes and changed the provision that allowed kids to basically come into the country. All right. Trump leaves. COVID goes down. The moment that Trump leaves, that notion of get out moderates. And not just moderates. If there's any country that has the gangs of Honduras or these horrible areas where basically There is no situation that an American president create a hostile environment that would keep people away that is in any way going to be tantamount or close to the hell that they're leaving. So you have a problem. How do you square that circle? And Donald Trump, who the American public, whatever you want to think of him, actually agreed with him more so on immigration than Democrats, basically was the guy who said, let's just build a wall. How does Democrats deal with that contradiction? Kim, what are your thoughts before? Because there's a video for Jen Psaki I want to play after you give your comments, just your basic thoughts on this. But what are your thoughts in regards to what I consider to be a contradiction that Democrats have on this notion of immigration?
Yeah, I mean, Democrats really have themselves in a bit of a pickle on this one, right? Because they talk, Joe Biden kind of did the same thing that Donald Trump did when Donald Trump got into office. He was adamant on just reversing anything Obama did. And it seems like Joe Biden got into office and he was just adamant on reversing anything Trump did. And unfortunately, when it came to the southern border, I think that Democrats really downplayed the seriousness of the issue. And now we're seeing, especially when Joe Biden decided to reverse what I think was actually a good compromise sort of policy, which was the wait in Mexico policy that said, look, which Canada, by the way, has as well with asylum seekers that are at the Canadian border. Many countries have it. And it's just one that says, look, if you're already in a safe country, then, you need to wait in the safe country while you're seeking asylum. And so when he ended that policy, I think that definitely amped up a lot of people wanting, realizing that it would be a lot easier getting into the United States than it was previously, and that the policies would be less harsh. And you're right. Look, these people, they're fleeing extreme poverty and gang violence and a crumbling economy. And they will absolutely, it's human nature to absolutely do anything you can to better the future of yourself or your child. So sending your child away saying, you know what, your life is better somewhere else and I'm going to miss you and it's going to be horrible, but your life is better. And the thing is that Americans are so privileged. Americans can't even fathom that, can't really understand that mentality. My family dealt with that. So, I understand that mentality. It's very personal in my family to have that because my family fled Vietnam and some were left behind and some, my aunt sent her child away. Her 4-year-old daughter, my cousin, was sent away with my family and she thought, I'm going to be stuck here in Vietnam, but I'll send you away. I mean, people can't understand that mentality, and that brings to your point of, we're not addressing the bigger issue as to why we're having the crisis, the overall reason why there's a crisis under Bush, under Obama, under Trump, and now under Biden. It is worse under Biden because I believe Biden just sort of opened up the front door and said, hey, come on in. In a way, that's kind of what they heard. But there is an underlying fundamental issue that we as a country have to address. And it does stem from how we treat those countries, how we tear them down or how we build them up. And we have torn them down and they desperately need to be built back up.
Well, yeah, I'm so glad you brought it there because that's where I would have taken it too. And doesn't that change the moral calculus here when it comes to how we treat refugees and asylum seekers from those countries? I mean, the U.S., I'm not an open borders advocate. I'm not crazy on this stuff. Not that I'm saying that open borders people are crazy, but maybe kind of. But at the same time, the U.S. has sort of put itself in an exceptional circumstance in how it has to deal with this problem because, like you just brought up, through coups, through long-running sanctions, and through various forms of political manipulation, we have brought this on ourselves, and we've done it to tens, hundreds of millions of people in the process. I'm not trying to just make it all about us, but shouldn't we deal with the consequences of this? How do we do that? What's your take, Kim?
Yeah, sorry, are you there? I cut out for just a second. I've always been really confused as to why the United States, and it's not really confusing. Obviously, our history, there's a reason why we're so much closer to Europe, right? Culturally, because we basically were started as a British colony. So we're closer to Europe in culture and in other things, language. But, our southern neighbors, it's always been so confusing to me why we haven't put more effort into building up our southern neighbors. You know, we do so much to build up our European neighbors, and they're not even our neighbors. And we do so much to build them up, but we don't do anything to build up the South. We just kind of instead sucked resources from them and then forgot about them. But, you know, kind of said, well, whatever. And it's such a beautiful culture. The people are wonderful. Everything is so great down there. I mean, I just really wish the United States would invest a lot more, especially in Mexico to start off with, in helping really bring them up to speed into the first world. I think something very similar would be nice if the United States could take a page out of China's book a little bit on what China's doing with Africa. I think that the United States could maybe attempt to do in South America and in Central America for sure.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask about this, let's play a clip. This is Jen Psaki being asked a question basically on what is Biden going to do? How are you going to stop the people? And I thought the answer was so wild. Basically, her response to this was that Joe Biden is telling people to stay away from America. And that seems to be the policy that these guys are going with. Let's play the clip real quick.
We just heard from Jake Sullivan talking about on immigration, the need to have a consistent and continued message to communicate to migrants that the border is closed right now. We saw Ambassador Jacobson. He says there has to be a message on the airwaves and in that region as well. If you want to send the message to migrants that the border is closed, shouldn't President Biden be the one who is clearly delivering that message?
Well, he did do an interview with Univision about 2 weeks ago and made that absolutely clear. And I certainly expect he will look for the opportunity to do exactly that. I will note, however, that he is one of the voices. Ambassador Jacobson is one of the voices. There are a number of effective voices in the region, including leaders in the region, including partners we need to have in the region, NGOs and others, to deliver the same message that now is not the time to come, that the majority of people are turned away at the border, which is backed up by factual data, that adult families will be turned away at the border in almost every scenario. And so that is part of the data and part of the information that we're looking for partnership to deliver in the region.
Is it working?
Well, again, Peter, I think we know, we've seen the numbers that CBP puts out on a regular basis. We know there are more children under the age of 18 who are, of course, coming across the border. That is consistent with what our policy has been. But in terms of people who were turned away, who are coming to the border, who are turned away, I mean, those numbers, are people hearing that? Are they still making the journey? I don't have any further analysis of that. I know that what people are looking at is that
let's stop it right there. Let's stop right there. Because Jen Psaki puts, man, they're all the same. It's like a 5-minute answer to basically say, no, it's not working. You don't want
she sounds anxious. She's kind of rambling there. Unlike Ned Price, who we've been criticizing for a little while now because he just gives boilerplate responses, just the most formulaic responses over at the State Department. Jen Psaki sounds like she's anxious and she's rambling because she's anxious. That's my takeaway. And I don't mean to read too much into it or psychoanalyze her, but I think for good reason, because this is a big issue the Biden admin has to deal with. Anyway, Jamarl, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. No, you're fine. You're right. She sounds anxious. She's being asked a question she doesn't want to ask. And the reporter's like, is it working? He knows the answer. He knows the answer is no. He knows the answer is no. 9,000 children and teenagers traveling without their parents crossed the southern border just last month alone. And right here, this quote is phenomenal. They were talking to a specialist on this. He was making the point. He said the current situation is really about unaccompanied children. Children arriving without parents or guardians, because for people who are coming in families or people who are coming in singles, most are still being sent back and not allowed into the country. But for unaccompanied minors, or unaccompanied children, the Biden administration made the decision to stop expelling them, to allow them to come into the country when they come to the border. And once in the country, they'll be able to come into what's known as shelter system. And at that point, it doesn't really matter what comes next. They're in the country, and they're in the system of that particular country, meaning they're in. Biden basically allowed the choice to say, hey, if they're unaccompanied, they can come in. And so by that choice taking place, and Donald Trump leaving, COVID going down, whether he's telling them this is not the time to come to America or not, you've just put out a welcome flag. Am I wrong? Like, it seems like a contradiction in what they want versus the messaging that they're sending based on the policy. What am I missing? Kim? I mean, like, am I missing something on that? It just seems like a contradiction.
No. Yeah, it's a contradiction. The messaging, because he's reversing literally hundreds of Trump's policies on immigration, literally hundreds of the policies Joe Biden is systemically one by one getting rid of. And that is sending the clear message to people that it's now is a good time, actually, to send your kids up. I mean, Jen Psaki can sit there and say, well, we've got people telling them it's not a good time. But when the policies are being reversed, the only thing the parents are hearing is actually now is a great time. And we are accepting everybody. And by the way, the whole campaign messaging that Democrats pulled on, kids in cages, guess what? These Hondurans and El Salvadorians, they don't care if their kid ends up in a cage in the United States. A cage in the United States is way better than what they see is happening for their children in their home countries. So it's not, for them, it's a no-brainer. If they can get their kid to the border and their kid can get in, and then you're right, then they're in the system and they're in the United States, and there's no way, what are we going to do with them at that point? Now they're in. And then we have to ask ourselves as a country, is it healthy to have thousands upon thousands of children in this country entering the system? Then they go into foster care. They're probably never going to be deported back to their countries. These are children that grow up into adulthood with no parenting. And that is not a healthy way to build a society. That's not going to work. It's going to be devastating for the communities that we live in, and it's devastating for the communities in really South America that are having to send their children away. They need their children